Hello and welcome to the webinar. This is the fourth webinar in our series of 5G in times of pandemic. In previous webinars, we talked about how did pandemic impact the acceleration of the use of cellular networks. We saw that 5G standard is going to have even greater importance now during, but even post-pandemic, because many people are now working from home, businesses have to adapt to a new environment, and the networks and the users are expecting the increased use of IoT and 5G as well. And in this seminar, we will look at pattern questions in the context of global trade and competition. So one of the issues that we are going to discuss is the global race for leadership in defining standards, supplying and building next generation of high-speed networks. And we will also discuss how companies are, how countries and companies are competing in the ownership of 5G, development of 5G, what effect it has on the strategic geopolitical level. For example, how does the ban of Huawei's 5G equipment impact the development and rollout of 5G networks? What would that mean for European American suppliers? We will also touch about the licensing framework of the 5G. Namely, we will see now connected cars, connected consumer devices, healthcare. Many industries will be using 5G. And do we need to adapt our licensing framework? How will licensing framework evolve? How to ensure efficient licensing? How will implementers know what's the price of the standard? Transparency in the ownership of 5G. So these are the questions we will touch in this seminar. And we have excellent line of speakers. So I'm very pleased to say that we'll first start with Kirti Gupta. She is an economist and engineer coming from Qualcomm, where she is Vice President of Technology and Economic Strategy. We will also have Luigi Parcu. He is professor here at European University Institute. He directs our Florence School of Regulation, Communications and Media, Florence Competition Program in Law and Economics, and Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom. We also have Bowman Heiden. He is a co-director of Center for Intellectual Property, which is a center that is a joint effort between Chalmers University and University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And he's also a visiting professor at Berkeley. And finally, we have Emilio Davila Gonzalez. He's head of sector of ICT standardization at the European Commission at DG Connect, and he is in charge of coordination of ICT standardization in DG Connect. So just a few quick rules. For the audience, please ask questions by typing questions to all, both panelists and attendees. We will address the questions at the end of presentation. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes for presentation. We will not be using microphones, camera, and raise hand features for the audience. So please write your questions in the chat. And that's it. So I would like to start with Kirti Gupta. Kirti, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Igor, and thank you for the team at EUI to organize this webinar and have all of us here for a timely discussion. I think, as you mentioned, Igor, the growing importance of 5G in the post-COVID world is a theme that the industry seems to be working on, and it doesn't seem to have slowed down deployment of 5G in any way. In fact, accelerated it. So taking a step back, really, starting with what is 5G, the newest generation of wireless. It's now here. It's designed to connect everything, everywhere, not just people to people, me to you, but machines to machines. It's really designed to provide a universal fabric of connectivity. Now, until now, when we used to talk about any previous generation of wireless or Gs, we used to talk about the traditional telecommunications industry players like the chip makers, the phone makers, the infrastructure or the network providers. But now 5G has truly gone global, not just in the world, but in terms of the usage of industries. No discussion on 5G can happen without the use of the technology in the auto industry almost immediately, in healthcare, in mining, in retail, and more in education. You know, you just mentioned how it's accelerated in the post-COVID world. One of the projects we are looking into is how do you determine the connectivity gap in some countries, and how that connectivity gap can be overcome by technologies like 5G providing education to everybody. So we'll see that acceleration continue, and as such, there are many, indicators and economic impact estimates of the value of 5G. For example, there's an IHS report that estimates 13.2 trillion value generated by 2035. GSMA has, specific estimates about direct and indirect revenue generated by 5G. So the importance of the technology in the industry is well understood. The importance of the technology by the governments is becoming well understood. Governments around the world have recognized the importance of the technology for their national security interests. If a technology is used to connect everything everywhere, you could imagine it's like having the airways, the waterways, and the railroads in a single technology transaction. So for that reason, there has been a significant focus on both sides of the Atlantic, in US and EU, on how do we ensure that the national security interests are maintained, technology leadership in this important technology is maintained, including certain geopolitical pressures and sanctions on companies like Huawei. So noting that and coming back to that in our following discussion would be important. Let me quickly talk about where does this technology come from? So when we talk about 5G, we often tend to talk about a monolith, but 5G is a layered technology. There is first a foundational layer, which I like to call the blueprint of a building. And once that foundation is established, different players, different technology developers can come and implement pillars on top of that foundation, like the phones and the chips and the network equipment. But the foundation needs to be established first. And that foundation is called, in our industry, the technology standards. The standards are where hundreds of companies come together and cooperatively innovate new solutions for cutting-edge industry requirements as a common pool of innovation. Now, in order to invest in these standards, one needs incentives. And these incentives comes from patenting these technologies and then licensing them widely if the technology becomes successful. Now, like many industries that tend to be R&D intensive, and telecommunications or the wireless industry is no exception. $100 trillion in R&D were invested over the last 7 years alone, just from private funds to create some of these $100 billion. I think I got the magnitude wrong. To create this generation of the technology, according to BCG and IHS and some other estimates. Now, just like any other industry that is this R&D intensive, there tends to be a small group of players that tend to serve as the R&D arm of the industry. Not everybody can invest in long-term R&D and risky R&D and wait for returns. And much like these industries, other such industries, then there are many other players in the ecosystem that tend to leverage this and build on top of this R&D. I like to call it the great innovator implementer divide, and it exists also here. I'll give you one estimate of the recent data from the 5G 3GPP standards. Over 770 entities participate in building these standards, and the majority, 472 members that came to these bodies to create these standards, didn't contribute technologies. They were there to learn, to understand, to implement. And among those 30% of the members that did contribute, 10 companies submitted majority, like 70% of the technical contributions. So you get the picture. The point is there's a small minority driving the R&D, and there's a big majority that's dependent upon using this technology. So the innovator-implementer divide is going to exist in these industries, and whatever policy discussions we have, we need to view it through that lens. Now, since you meant to talk about the licensing models, let's bring the licensing in context. In the context of this is innovator-implementer divide, and in the context of what that means for the ecosystem. So like I mentioned, there are many estimates of the value generated by 5G. Let's talk about an estimate that the industry agrees upon, GSMA. And GSMA says, there's direct impact, indirect impact, et cetera, of this technology. So just looking at GSMA's direct numbers, $4.8 trillion of economic value generated by cellular until now, until 2019. Let's take that number. And now let's take the licensing revenues in context, which is like 8 to 13 billion per year. That's less than 0.3% of the overall pie that is generated. So it gives us the context of the licensing businesses and their size compared to the overall size of the 5G economy, if you will. Now, this is important because the industry is going to have to contend with the innovator-implementer divide. The policymakers will have to contend with the importance of 5G for national security and the importance of 5G for technology leadership and why it matters. It matters not just today because of the immediate national security concerns. It also matters tomorrow because it matters to governments how the innovation agenda of an industry is going to be defined. Is it going to be defined dependent on states and their industrial policy goals? Or is it going to be defined cooperatively like today by industries based on the needs of the market? And that's why, we need to keep an eye on the technology leadership story and the innovation mechanisms, not just for 5G, but future generations like 6G. So in conclusion, the call to action is when we think of policy prescription for ensuring the development of 5G and 6G and Europe's technology leadership, we need to consider the context for the size and the importance of the 5G economy, the limited role of licensing, and the importance of incentivizing the innovation through a robust system, not just a patent system, but a system of the standards development organizations working well, working as a robust mechanism with good governance principles. I think that was a good ground covered for teeing up the discussion. So I'll stop here. I would love to hear the perspective of other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirti. Now I would like to ask Luigi if he can present us our research here at EY about where is the 5G innovation, who is leading.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I will present a few slides very quickly. Okay, well, I wanted to start this conversation by telling you something about some research we are doing at the Florence School of Regulation, Communications and Media in this project we have about innovation. And this is a research we are conducting with Niccolo Innocenti and Chiara Carrozza, specifically this paper that I want to tell you something about. The reflection is about this. We started from this idea, how can we, I just heard Kirti saying that the economics of 5G is much larger than the licenses. Still, we wanted to start from the point of, how can we look at who is leading 5G? And so we start from the point of view of innovation, because 5G is a new technology that is coming to the market, it's not there yet. So will see is full development in the next few years. So we start from the innovation, from the starting point. Innovation, obviously, we know is a difficult thing to measure, and probably patents are a good proxy to have a look at who is leading in innovation, and so who is leading the future of the development of the industry. But to understand leadership clearly, especially in 5G, but I would say in general, and specifically when there are issues of standards and those standard essential patents, counting patents is not a great solution. I mean, it could be a first indicator, but it's never the answer. So what we have done is take inspiration from the literature on complexity in an attempt, economic literature on complexity, in an attempt to find a more advanced tool to measure, to gauge the innovation race. And so we have been, while we plan and we are working now on the idea to try to estimate complexity directly. For this, let's say, first step, intermediate step, we have chosen two dimensions of the complexity that are diversity. That means look at the patents and see how many different technologies a country, we are working with countries for the moment, then we will work later also for single companies, but for the moment we are aggregating countries. How many different technology a country is able to license in respect to a technology like 5G. So diversity is a first dimension. A second dimension that we are looking at is ubiquity. So how rare are the technology that a country is mastering? The cross of these two dimensions, diversity and ubiquity, gives you an indication of complexity. It's not the whole story. We want to go further into the whole story, but for the moment is an interesting start. So these two dimensions gives us a first indication of where the technological race for 5G stands at the end of 2019. And this is our answer. You can have a look at this table. You can see here that from this dimension, we see that the US at in the years on 2010, looking at the density and ubiquity 2010-2019, technological specialization, the US are ahead of the race. In the area that is between the area in which there is rareness, so not technology that are rare, and many technology, you can see also China, Japan, and Korea, but with some serious advantage from the US. Then, if you look at the other side of the picture, you can see several European countries, some other Asian countries, Taiwan, Hong Kong, but several European countries, but all in this area with some diversity, but less, and technologies that are a bit more common. So if we have to look at this, the first answer we can give is that is clearly there is a clear advantage for US and then China and then the few other Asian countries. If you look at the dynamic in the second table, I show you the dynamic split in the two groups of years, these 10 years in two groups of 5. It's interesting because it shows, because the beginning, the first 5 years is the moment of the invention really, and then the second 5 years is clearly the standards are still in elaboration, so it's a process, but shows you when you begin to apply somehow this patents becomes more applied in a sense, let's say, more advanced, more also detailed. Well, if you look at on the left, you see that at the beginning, for instance, there were countries like Italy, for instance. Italy has some basic ability to invent. So they were in the picture at the beginning. But if you look at the second period, when things get more advanced and sophisticated, Italy is not there anymore in our numbers. The advantage of the US is increasing. China is still there, and Japan in the second period entered. This ability of Japan to develop things quickly. So you see, now there are obviously in the second group on the right, you see more countries than before, because it's easier somehow to follow up. And clearly we have a cutoff, so I'm not saying that there are no license from Italy, obviously they are there, but they are cut off from the way in which we cut this. So you see, this is the, the way in which we are seeing the countries at this moment, with this US advantage at the moment. Let's have this the same look, but in another dimension, a dimension that is regional. And being in Europe, and as European, we are interested to this regional dimension. Well, you can see here that the situation is a bit different. Europe, that wasn't at all, no European countries. Let me go back a second, show you this. Here you cannot find in the right quadrant, that is an important quadrant of the advanced technology, there are no European countries, no Sweden, no Finland, the countries that were very important in the first G's generation of mobile, they are not there anymore. However, if you look at the areas, at the regions, and you look at Europe altogether, you see that Europe is slightly behind Asia. Asia is behind America, but Europe is not that far from Asia, if you look at Europe altogether. Well, let's have a look at this also in the two periods. That is interesting also. And you can see that somehow in the first 5 years of the development, Europe was a bit farther, and now is getting closer to Asia. So somehow this is an interesting result for Europe. So let me go quickly to the conclusion of this line of reasoning. Well, we are seeing a clear leadership. If this discussion is about who is leading 5G, it's clear that the US are leading in 5G technologies, at least if we look at patents, and we interpret patents as the proxy of innovation. And China is running up in this with following the US. Europe, as a fragmented, as a single country, is clearly out of the race. It's practically out of the race. But if we look at Europe as a region, there are indications that can still, if Europe, if the EU in particular, is able to coordinate the innovation effort of the member state, to try to unify, integrate somehow this innovation effort, then we could have a competitor in the game. But, however, let's say some word of caution here is that lagging countries will find main difficulties in catching up, because things, and the impression we have from the previous numbers, and we will, on the study we are doing, is that the distances are increasing, not decreasing, because the technology becomes more sophisticated as long as new releases of the standard are decided. So the gap may be accelerating. So the time for this European effort of unification, acceleration in the effort to compete is limited. There is an occasion, there is still a space, but this space needed to be exploited as soon as possible, in a sense. So it's a question if we will be able to re-enter this game in time to become an important player. And for the moment, I stop here. I wanted just to present this research, and then we'll discuss. Thanks.
Thank you, Luigi. Very interesting research and very bad news for Europe. So I will have some questions about it later. But let's turn now to Bo, who will tell us a bit more about standardization model, the evolution of standardization, and something a bit about geopolitical technology competition. So Bo, the floor is yours.
So yeah, I just want to, I'll talk a little bit about intertwining some of the issues. I'll touch base a bit on what Kirti talked about a little bit graphically, and then I'll get into some geopolitics issues slides I haven't used before. So we'll see how they go. I'm trying them out now for the first time, and we'll see how that works. So the first thing is maybe to step a little bit further back from what Kirti talked about, and say that, originally in the original Gs, the first few Gs of cellular technology, many firms were focusing on their own solutions, working in their own geographical markets, and there was a lot of competition amongst each other for these. And that competition led into one dominant design taking over, one efficient activity that turned into an open consensus standard development effort, now mostly through 3GPP or entirely through 3GPP. There was a lot of competition before this. So sometimes I think people think that we just started here on the right side, but we didn't. We had a long, typical battle of de facto and collaborative standards before we solidified into one major standard where instead of competing on the product market, we compete on the technology market to see which technology should be included into one major global standard and then rolled out for the rest of the world, which I think everyone pretty much agrees with, has created a lot of value and creates a huge market. That's why we have these huge numbers that we're talking about. So it's good to start there because I'll return to this in the end. And just to graphically describe a little bit what Kirti said, people have to be, in order to be able to produce these standards, they have to be incentivized to participate. So my saying is that patents are essential to creating cellular standards, excuse the pun, right? So you have to have them, otherwise people won't be incentivized to participate. So people putting in lots of money before they're even selected. So then people hunt, so billions of dollars going into R&D, and then we go into the development process where we have millions of person hours putting this together, working collaboratively in a consensus manner to pick the best technologies. And of course, if anyone's worked on a team of like 5 or 10 people in their own organization, every time I hear about how many people work together under consensus, it's just remarkable that we're able to put this together. I mean, I was part of with Emilio, part of the expert committee trying to figure out what was actually just going on in the world. That took us 2 years and we struggled. So luckily we got the report done before 6G. So I'm always amazed that we're able to do this. And of course, producing trillions of dollars of economic impact. Kirti used the $4.8 trillion number. It doesn't, even if I use the $4.2 trillion number, you're not going to see the slice of the pie that represents SEP licensing, because as we say, it's a very small piece, even though it represents a lot of the motivation that drives the value behind the total pie. And I also broke out here a little bit the smartphone. So you can see that the smartphone part of the value chain is not that big either compared to the overall value. And the more downstream part past the smartphone is growing and growing and growing with apps and IoT solutions as we go forward. So this is a little context. I know Kirti talked about this, but just again, I think we always have to start here by saying, if someone would have told me that this was possible, I would not be sure we would pull it off. It's such an incredible thing that we've done. So we have to kind of take some pride in that when we think about what policies to do. So a couple of years ago, I wrote a paper on the political economy of FRAND, the battle to define the meaning of FRAND. So on the market, we work together in many ways, and we put things out on the market. And then usually later than when products are on the market, there's a discussion about SEP licensing, and because it becomes late, then the issue is how much should it be? It's always going to be an issue of price. And because FRAND, the meaning of FRAND determines what will be the royalties, the actors, of course, are interested to define the rules of the game. So actors are trying to define what FRAND means. I think fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory is wonderfully vague. That's why I describe it as wonderfully vague. It allows for things to happen in a very good way. We wouldn't have this 4.8 trillion if it wasn't working relatively well. But there's still plenty of room to define this in different interests. So you can play the game on the market, but you can also play the game to define the rules of the game. And you can see here that actors working through antitrust authorities, through standard setting or standard development organizations, probably a better term, through judicial arena, and in the US you have ITC, can of course start through the arena, define FRAND in different ways. So as we see different decisions come out of different courts, this defines the framework for FRAND, which is then embedded back into the negotiations. If at some point in time everyone got the same answer when they went to these organizations, we probably would stop going to them and we would enter some steady state. but that hasn't really happened. So I built this model to talk about how firms relate to this system. But of course, we could put countries in here as well, because each one of these antitrust arenas is in a different country. SDOs compete or could compete more with each other, more than they do now. The judicial arenas could compete. We have these anti-suit, anti-suit. And so we have this competition between competition authorities even. So you can see this on a global level as well. So this is all done on this, leading to the last point I want to make about the overall context of this geopolitical technology competition that's really sitting there above everything. And if you can see from 1960 to 2016, the US used to lead in R&D, 69% of R&D spending, now it's 28%. This is a little US centric, but if I look at the development over time, you can see that China passed the EU 28 in 2016, and soon will probably pass the United States as well. So this game has changed dramatically and has come very quickly for many people. I'm producing a paper that'll come out in a couple of weeks called Innovation Warfare. It's a bit of a provocative title, but it's a little bit about this Cold War technology developments that are coming out in the world nowadays. And when you look into the paper, when we did the research in our paper, we looked around, and there's a lot of different ways that the US and China compete for this technology dominance. And you could also add Europe to that, although US and Europe haven't worked together as much as they typically do. Maybe that'll change in the next administration. And there's a lot of different, and the most important thing about this slide is that most of this stuff is legal. So China is being more strategically initiated in how that they're trying to appropriate technology and build this technology lead that they've been very clear about in their latest 5-year plan. And one of these ones here is this consensus standards, trying to understand and how to dominate and create at least a strong or strongest position in that as well. So then what we end up with is this idea of thinking a bit about where we will be in this process of standards. Where will we go? Certainly, as Kirti said, one of the great things about this is that we all get together on a world basis and we work together. But certainly 5G and all the other fourth industrial revolution technologies are going to be very, very strategic areas, not only for economic growth, but for national security. 5G is no exception. As you said, if everything's connected, that's obviously a very strategic technology. So will we see more deglobalization? Because I think the one thing that the pandemic did open up the eyes to a lot of people was that globalization is good, except when people stop producing things in different parts of the world, then everything starts to fall apart. And wait a second, aren't some of those things that other people are producing really important to us? Why are we letting them produce it all, like PPE and other things like that? So we could end up with a type of deglobalization. Maybe people will even start thinking about maybe moving back to different standards in different parts of the world. That could possibly be an issue. If we think about the first Cold War, if we talk about Cold War 2.0, what my colleague Neil Ferguson calls it at Hoover, I don't think we would have bought base stations from the Soviet Union. And now this is the first talk, I think, on SCPs that's ever used the term Soviet Union. So that's a new thing for today. But and so certainly with China, we would think, okay, is this what we should do? But our economies are extremely intertwined compared to how it was with the first Cold War. And so how are we going to balance this type of issues of geopolitical competition in this very intertwined world? How will we keep the good things without throwing out the bad things, but still think about national security? I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion and touch on many trade and geopolitical geopolitics in general, and even as well as the system for cellular technology and the standardization process is going. I think that it won't be immune to this as well, as we already see with Huawei and other actors. One last quick point is, it's interesting too to see that you can sometimes you're banning the physical products from moving around, the physical infrastructure, but that doesn't stop the standardization being done in an open way, and it doesn't stop people from having patents in different jurisdictions. So this intellectual value chain is still working, even though sometimes the physical value chain is not. And that'll be another interesting aspect to think about. Thanks, Igor. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bo. I'm looking forward to reading your next paper. This sounds very interesting. And now to turn to Emilio, who will tell us a bit more about the European Commission. What are the plans in the support and deployment of 5G and of licensing 5G standard essential patents? So, Emilio.
Thank you, Igor, and thank you for the invitation to be with you today. And today we have this webinar, and this shows you the importance already of the connectivity and standards in general, and even in a more broad terms of standards that allow us in these terms of pandemics to keep our activity going. So it's not only that they are fundamental for the digital economy and society, but also that we have seen without the standards, the situation with COVID would have been much worse. I will not enter too much into the importance of 5G and connectivity, because Kirti has already explained it. This is the advantage of being the last speakers. And that's why we have supported the deployment of 5G. We adopted some years ago, and together with the member states, this 5G action plan, and we have invested in Europe millions on research and deployment in order to be ready for and be leaders in the 5G race. And we have also supported the creation of public and private partnerships to try to address what Luigi Parcu was saying, to avoid the fragmentation of European efforts, but rather go together into the same direction. And in this 5G, but not only 5G, in all the aspects towards a digital economy, we believe that it's very important to have open global standards. And both have explained very well the difference between having de facto proprietary standards that are controlled by one or a few players, or having open standards that could be accessible to any innovators that then want to add additional innovation in on top of those foundations. And that we are really convinced as defenders of these open global standards for several reasons. One is what Bo has explained, that you are not locked into a particular vendor who can impose the particular conditions, and in that sense, it would be better if you can have access to standards that, even if they may be protected by patents, where you know that in principle there is a commitment to license them in a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory way, rather than to need to negotiate with some parties that have the full control and has no preconditioned for you then to license his patented proprietary technology. And of course, something very important is the interoperability that the standards provides. The fact that all the different devices, services, applications can communicate all together for the connectivity, for the global world in which we are. And in particular in Europe, where we have already 27 member states, if we don't have interoperability to have cross-border services for our citizens, then we have a problem to even realize the single market. And a standard also ensure access to different markets and promote a lot of innovation. You don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. I've seen some questions whether it's more expensive to participate in a standardization, in collective one, or just rather to go to your own solutions. I mean, the amount of resources you need to invest to have these standards, so complex standards like they are 4G, 5G, and now we will start soon with 5G. It's impossible to be bear by just one company of very reduced group of companies. That's the importance of this competition system that is in the standard. So where competitors can still collaborate in order to have global standards to define the foundations in which then they will build their services for the benefit of all, including the system and including others that can benefit for those standards. So for that, we need to have a win-win system. And for that, we really need to have a sustainable standardization system that is able to deliver those standards that we need. And there again, it comes what Bob was explaining. We need incentives for people to participate in standardizations. When we are talking about connectivity standards, we are talking about a sector which is very much based on intensive research. So you have to invest billions in research in a qualitative way, of course, but also then invest on standardization. Bob has explained it well. You have hundreds of people working together, coming to technical committees all around the world, now virtual, hopefully soon we will travel again. And then at the end of the day, your contribution may be there. Some of them, yes, some others will go to another player there because the best technology should go into the standards. And this, you need some incentives to be able to participate. And in this sector where we are talking about the standards based on research incentive, patents are very important to recoup these investments. And then allowing to move to next generation system in a technology world that progresses so quickly, because we have not all the deployment of 5G, we are already thinking about 6G and etc. And telecom is, in terms of research intensity, the second domain after microelectronics. And we see in 5G, we have thousands of patents and tens of thousands of contributions to 3GPP. So this shows that a lot of innovation are needed and they are embedded in this next generation of communication systems and all around the value chain, radio, network, application, and then handsets. And the same will is expected to apply for 6G and even more with emergency of new radio concepts. So for that, really, you need the incentives. And if we come back to the importance in terms of global trade and competitive situation, we have seen already that some of our trade partners like Japan and Korea have published their 6G roadmaps. And there is clearly stated that patent, and in particular standard essential patents having a dominant position there is part of their strategic objectives. So we should not be naive in Europe and follow a similar path to support our industry and support the research and investment and go for having a good technology basis that could bring this patented technology into the standards if we want to stay at a similar level as being important in the global standardization and in the communication ecosystem. So, and regarding in particular the issue of standard essential patents, the Commission explained its view and its policy in a communication that we launched on 2017. And what we want to see there is a balanced framework ensuring a level playing field so we can have this sustainable standardization system. And this is to ensure on one side a fair return for the technologies contributed to the standards, and at the same time, a reasonable and non-discriminatory access to the patented technology for anybody that would like to implement the standards. So for instance, based on FRAND licensing, and depending on the sector, it could be even royalty-free. And with more and more patents and more newcomers to the system, because we have more objects and devices interconnected, we also believe that we need more transparency. So every player could know what he could expect, to whom approach in case of needing to license the patented technology and having more certainty of predictability. And important, we believe that there is no one-size solution fitting for all in terms of the licensing framework. So in that case, we believe that the negotiation between the different partners is better and that the different sectors should find efficient solutions for their licensing. We are promoting more transparent in that sense. For instance, patent pools or licensing platforms could facilitate these licensings. And we are also, we supported a pilot to try to see whether essentiality checks would also favor this more transparent and predictable framework. And then we also supported these expert groups that Paul was explaining, because he's a member of it, and trying to help and to bring new ideas outside the box that would help. And soon we expect to have this report published that could help with promoting this sustainable and level playing environment. So in summary, we will continue supporting the development of open standards. This is a clear policy from the Commission. And for that, we will support this sustainable standardization ecosystem, open to all, which can provide enough incentives for innovators to contribute and can allow at the same time a fair access to implementers to those open standards. And in the same time, we aim at Europe having a strong leadership position in the global ICT standardization ecosystem. And for that, we will continue supporting via research and innovation programs and also bringing together all our stakeholders from the public and private sectors, promote the development of patented technology that could be brought into this standardization ecosystem, ensuring that also European values are defended there, and promoting internationally a transparent level playing field for the licensing of those standard essential patents, so the system is not upgrading or put at risk. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilio. Great presentation. Let me just ask a few of my questions to the panelists, and then we also received some questions from the audience. Now, I would like to ask Pier Luigi, because I understand from his study that it was found out that the US companies are leading in developing 5G technology, but there are reports by for example, IPlytics, Bird & Bird, that looked at declared standard essential patents. And they found that actually it's Asian companies, Chinese companies, also European companies that are actually number 1 or number 2 in place of declared SAPs, and that US companies are lagging behind then in China, behind Chinese and US companies. So how do you explain the discrepancies in this research?
Well, Igor, the question is exactly what I was trying to explain at the beginning. If you just count, okay, if you count patents, you really don't know how you are counting. But so to establish leadership by number of patents is not a great idea, because patents can be totally different in their value, in their sophistication, in the contribution they give to the technology. And unfortunately, even self-declared standard essential patents are not much better than patents per se, because we know that unfortunately this declaration of essential is a declaration that is substantially unchecked. There are new attempts to be more able to check, but that's something for the future. But for the moment, essentially, these are auto-declaration. What we try to do is to, as I said, apply some theoretical ways to select within the databases of patents, trying to put in light certain characteristics. For instance, diversity, ubiquity are characteristic of patents. And if you manage to cross more and more of these elements, probably you have a better picture. And I think our picture is more realistic than the picture that simply counts patents. That's not, I don't think this is reality.
Igor, if I may,
yes,
I just add something to that question? So I do think, from the perspective of sitting in the industry, we see many reports like this, IPlytics, unified patents, yes. Patent sites, econ sites, like there are tons of such companies out there that claim, some kind of counting based methods to determine leadership, if you will, or in different technology areas. Broadly, if we were to go back to Bo's slide on the political economy of FRAND, I think we could add one more player there, which is these analytics companies trying to come up with metrics for determining leadership in this technology to ultimately influence FRAND or other such policies. And I don't think, we should assign much weight to that because, especially if you're a policymaker like Emilio, we have to recognize that these companies have their own incentives, right? These companies primarily are living based on the model of subscription of their data from users. And there has to be some sort of fear mongering to say, look, the leadership space is so fragmented. You guys need, subscription to my data to understand what's going on. Look, China is leading. Those data is, easily corrupted because there's a long-standing 30, 40 years of economic literature that shows patent counts really mean nothing. There's a very high heterogeneity. It's recognized, established in the economics literature for a long time, but that's sort of lost in this analytics companies noise, if you will. So I really think that that's why Luigi's work is so important, because we need more systematic work from institutions that don't have a sort of monetary incentive in pushing a product like these analytics companies on these important topics. So I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Kirti. Let's just address one question, very interesting question from the audience. So I think this is more for Bo, Kirti, and Emilio. We'll see. So let me just try to summarize it. So the question is that the Japanese Patent Office proposed a patent reform which would limit access to injunctive relief for SAPs that read on a minor aspect of IoT device. So basically, if SAP reads on minor aspect of IoT device, it should be denied injunctions. So the question is, well, what do you think about this? Is it maybe better to, is it sensible to focus more on protecting follow-on innovation at the expense of stronger patent protection? Or also should EU follow suit? Or what will EU do? Or will EU stick to protecting more patentees? So what do you think? Who would like to start to give an opinion? Okay, Bo, first.
The question kind of contains some things that I think are that overlook some issues in a way. I think it's a good question, first of all, and I've looked into this a bit, but I didn't see that it was as serious an effort as some people make it out to be. First of all, the eBay ruling in 2006. So the US is 14 years ahead of Japan in making it difficult to get an injunction. So that's not a new thing. Europe didn't follow up on that one immediately either. So I don't think, first of all, that this is going to change the process in Europe. I think the idea of FRAND is that we are going to license. And so the goal is to license. I mean, if in the end, even if an injunction is received, it's not to stop people from producing something, because of course that would stop the whole system. So the whole idea is how do people get paid in a timely manner for the work that they've done. I think that the model where you get an injunction if people are unwilling is reasonable in between point that Europe has right now. I'm not sure they're going to move off of that. This idea that that there really isn't an issue between the people who innovate upstream and the people who innovate downstream. As Kirti mentioned, and I tried to explain, there is no SEP patent. There are no SEPs stopping people from innovating downstream. In fact, I haven't seen any evidence that anyone's even thought about SEPs when they went to innovate until much, much later on. So of course, maybe that creates contention later on, but it doesn't stop markets from forming and people from innovating downstream. When I work with lots of small companies, my problem is to get them to think about patents at all. The last thing to think about is I'm not going to launch my product because I'm worried about some patent thicket. I would probably fall over in shock if an entrepreneur said that to me. So we haven't necessarily seen that this would be an issue. It wouldn't be something that I think the whole system is designed to move forward in a positive way. I don't think it would make much difference.
But
Go ahead.
really quickly to Igor, I think the question you're referring to, the report you're referring to is Japanese Patent Office's. It's an interim report on SEP licensing in the era of IoT and 5G, IoT and AI, I'm sorry. It's an interim report, so it hasn't been finalized yet. So JPO doesn't have any recommendation so far on whether or not injunctions should be sought for 5G SEPs related to IoT. They're merely asking the question and getting input. They haven't made a final recommendation yet, including in their interim report. So factually, just that one clarification there. But even if they were to, I think there are two things we must note. Number one, there's sort of a growing, I think that the ship has sailed on the issue of injunctions and the ability of standard essential patents or any kind of patents to be able to at least even seek injunctions without a competition law violation. We had that debate like 10 years ago, but most recently we have really clear guidance from various agencies in the US and from various courts around the world, right? We had the US Patent Office, the Department of Justice, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, jointly state in a joint statement that seeking injunctions for standard essential patents is, per se allowed, just like any other patent. There should be no special rules for special patents. That was really made clear in the United States as a policy statement. At around the same time, over the last few months, we have seen court decisions from the highest court in the land in Germany and in UK, in the Siswell and the Unwired Planet versus Huawei case, where the courts have said the same thing. They have reiterated that seeking of an injunction by standard essential patents, owners of SEPs, is, should be viewed under the facts and not a per se rule for a competition law violation. So it seems like the ship has sailed. It would be really odd for the JPO now to take a position that is, at contrast with these sort of big global developments. And more importantly, let's just, take that hypothetical question and do a thought experiment. If Europe were to do that, would that serve Europe's interests? Because Europe would only have a jurisdiction over European patents. So you could only really limit injunctions for European patents, and therefore you would be really, proportionately disincentivizing those European companies that are reflected in Pier Luigi's data that are still in the lead for these technologies. I just, even from a policy perspective, that not only would it be at odds, it wouldn't probably be aligned with the objectives that Emilio has been mentioning.
If I may add to this, this reminds me, as Kirti has explained, we have had this discussion, at least in particular in some standard organizations in the IPR committees, whether the injunctions were available or notified or SEPs. In Europe, I think the situation was clear that the injunctions were possible, but it was clearly then after and the rules and guidance from the European Court of Justice in the Huawei versus CTE, this has been clearly explained in which conditions one could ask for injunction. And in fact, this is what the different rules in Europe are applying. And not only in Europe, we have seen that these guidelines that are provided by the European Court of Justice in the Huawei versus CTE, basis which conditions should the SEP holders comply in order for them to be considered as a good faith, or licensees should comply if they want to go for antitrust defense against the SEP holders. This has created some standards globally as well. And this is what we believe it could be. We tried that it is in Europe to promote this balance system, and we believe that this could be become a standard globally. We have also these dialogues with the different trade partners in order to exchange views on the different possibilities. But so far, we don't think that we should move and change the system. On the contrary, I mean, the Huawei versus CT has been very clear, providing the guidance of the situation in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now just in time, but I would like to add just one quick question that I think we need to address now about licensing SEPs in the 5G. Do you think there is a room for greater use of patent pools or somehow to define the price of a standard so that companies in automotive, consumer devices, healthcare, they would know how much 5G costs? So very quickly, if we can, well, to all panelists. So maybe start with Kirti and then go to others.
I think broadly your question is there room for more transparency in terms of prices for different industry uses of this technology? And absolutely, yes. With the Commission's, push, it's helpful that the industry players try to come up with these solutions in a market-based way together to try to avoid disputes and litigation proactively. And hopefully, we'll see more and more of those efforts over the next several months and years.
Thank you. Pier Luigi?
I think that it's clear that 5G is the technology that is going to impact many more sectors than before, than was used to done by previous technology, mobile technologies. So it's clear that both institutions and markets somehow have to adjust to this evolution, and they will. I think it's only a question of time, of negotiation, of also of regulation when needed. But I think that this will come, and I think that all this is much preferable to a different situation. I don't enter, we are concluding, but to a different situation in which a world of trade secrets, of closed gardens prevail. I think that this is of the standard, and their industrial application and implementation is a world in which it's easier to adjust to market, because much more is in the open, and that's very important in my opinion.
Okay, what do you think, Bo?
I missed the question a bit. Something happened with my internet. Could you repeat it quickly again?
Do you think in the 5G, do we need more transparency regarding the price? What is the ultimate price of a standard, use of patent pools as a model? What's your opinion?
Well, it would seem, as Kirti said before, I think almost everyone believes that transparency could be better. Of course, transparency is usually a solution for something else. The question is, how are the different actors in the system able to work together to find the right FRAND rate that allows for this system that we talked about that's working so well to continue? It would seem that because of the transaction costs of so much IoT solutions, that more pooling type arrangements and more collective arrangements like this would facilitate that. And of course, if my suggestion is always that there's lots of different norms in all these different verticals that are now where connectivity is converging. So the SCP holders and now these more downstream new implementers in these verticals need to talk to each other as early as possible. I think they should talk as early as possible to understand how their markets work, how they could relate together. Pricing, of course, earlier the better, but it's tricky because there's so many use cases where we don't know what's going to happen. People are coming up with new IoT solutions all the time. If we set a price too high or too low, we wouldn't necessarily cover these new ideas. So I know everyone would like things to be early, but because of the entrepreneurial nature, it's better that there's an early dialogue and that we can have some type of price differentiation for different types of use cases, even within the same industry vertical. That would give us the greatest flexibility.
Thank you. And finally, Emilio, to conclude, do you think the Commission will take some action or leave it maybe for the market to decide? What's your view?
we clearly support this idea of having more transparency, and we have encouraged this creation of patent pools or other licensing platforms. And we are looking at some solutions that have appeared in the market, in particular in the context of Internet of Things and connected vehicles, for instance. Yes, and we see it as positive, and what we have heard from the different stakeholders, both patent holders and implementers of the standards, that could help to find more predictability and ensure a more smoother licensing platform. Now, of course, there are difficulties, like Bob says, because it's difficult to say, okay, if I adopt the standards, you don't know even at the moment of the adoption of the standards evolves in the time, what will be all the use cases and what will be the final value that the patented technology brings into the possible use cases for the different sectors. But promoting these kind of platforms and the talk between the different parties in the system and having a good faith negotiation, and at the end of the day, having these patented pools of licensing platforms that could define the transparency licensing price for the different sectors, we really believe that could be a good way forward. If so far we prefer the market, of course, to talk together and to talk each other and then bring solutions into there. We already expressed in our communication, I refer in 2017, that if there should be further measures if these efforts are ineffective, in particular taking into account all the coming IoT sectors and the interest of all the parties, then we may consider additional measures. But in principle, we prefer the market to talk and to bring with the solutions.
Thank you very much, Emilio. And with this, I would like to close this webinar. Thank you very much to all the panelists and to participants, and join us on the 3rd of December for the final edition on 5G and big tech. The link is in the chat. So thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thanks.